November 1944. Elsie Schneider pressed her face against the cold metal slats of the transport truck. Her stomach knotted with a fear so profound it had replaced hunger as her primary sensation. 21 German women sat in silence around her, their gray auxiliary uniforms now little more than tattered evidence of a war that had already moved beyond them. They had been captured in France during the chaotic Allied advance, processed through holding facilities in England, where guards had been professional but distant, and now found themselves being delivered to an American prisoner of war camp in a place called Massachusetts, a state none of them had ever heard of in a country they had been taught to hate with the same certainty they had been taught to love the Reich. The propaganda had been very clear about what awaited captured German soldiers in America: torture, starvation, cruelty designed to break the spirit and destroy the body. Americans were barbaric, the broadcasts had promised. They violated every rule of civilized warfare. They took pleasure in the suffering of their enemies. Else had believed every word because believing had been easier than questioning. Because at 24 years old, working in a Stuttgart factory that produced nothing but smoke and promises, she had needed to believe that her sacrifices served some greater purpose, that the hunger and the fear and the constant bombardment meant something beyond simple survival. The truck slowed, then stopped with a mechanical shudder that sent the women swaying against each other. Through the slats, Elsie could see wire fencing and wooden guard towers rising against the pale November sky. A sign in English marked the entrance to what would become their new reality, though the words meant nothing to her limited understanding of the language. The rear gate opened, flooding the dark interior with cold sunlight that made them all squint and shield their eyes. An American officer stood waiting, a woman in uniform which surprised Elsie more than she wanted to admit. Her expression was neither cruel nor kind. It was something Elsie could not quite identify, something that would take weeks to understand. It looked almost like concern. The women climbed down from the truck with movements made stiff by days of travel and the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from knowing you have been defeated. Several had to steady themselves against the vehicle's metal frame, their legs trembling as they touched solid ground for the first time in what felt like forever. Else noticed how the American guards watched them with curiosity rather than hatred. The detail unsettled her more than open aggression would have. She had been prepared for cruelty. She had armed herself with dignity and silence, ready to endure whatever torments her captors might devise. But she did not know how to interpret this strange absence of malice. She did not know what to do with guards who looked at her as if she were simply another person, rather than a defeated enemy. Captain Ruth Anderson stood before the assembled prisoners, her posture military, but her expression softer than any German officer Elsie had ever encountered. Through a translator, an older German-American sergeant who spoke with a heavy accent that marked him as someone who had left the old country decades ago, the captain explained the camp rules. They would be housed in converted barracks. They would be assigned work based on their skills. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The words were formal, bureaucratic, carrying the weight of international law rather than personal sentiment. Elsa listened and felt confusion growing where fear had been. This did not sound like the brutal captivity the propaganda had promised. Where was the cruelty? Where was the systematic degradation of prisoners that German broadcasts had described in such vivid detail? Captain Anderson's voice held nothing but professional detachment as she outlined daily schedules and expectations. She might have been describing a work camp or a military posting, not a facility designed to contain defeated enemies. But it was the man standing slightly behind Captain Anderson who drew Elsie's attention and held it with magnetic force. Staff Sergeant Raymond Mitchell, perhaps 41 years old, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of outdoor labor and indoor grief. His eyes were the color of winter sky over Pennsylvania, pale and cold, and they swept over the assembled German women with an expression Elsa recognized immediately because she had seen it in mirrors after the bombing raids on Stuttgart. Hatred. Not the hot, explosive hatred of propaganda posters. Something colder, more controlled, more dangerous. The hatred of a man who had learned to bank his fire but never to extinguish it completely. Staff Sergeant Mitchell held a small notebook, and as Captain Anderson spoke, he wrote, observing everything, recording details, building some kind of case that Elsie could not yet understand but instinctively feared. His attention felt different from the curious glances of the other guards. This was the focus of someone keeping accounts, someone who believed in debts that must eventually be paid. The camp itself was smaller than Else had expected, clearly not designed for large numbers of prisoners. The main building looked recently converted from some other purpose, its wood still pale and relatively new. Through the windows, she could see rows of cots with thin mattresses and folded blankets. It looked Spartan but clean, nothing like the overcrowded chaos she had endured during the final weeks before her capture. Still, it was a prison. They were captives. And nothing about the tidy appearance could change that fundamental reality. As they were led toward the barracks, Elsa noticed the kitchen building nearby. Smoke rose from its chimney in steady gray columns, and even from a distance she could smell something cooking. Her stomach clenched painfully at the scent, a physical response so intense it made her momentarily dizzy. It had been 3 days since their last proper meal, months since she had eaten anything that could be called adequate. The German rations had grown progressively smaller as supply lines collapsed, and by the time of her capture, she had been surviving on whatever scraps could be found in the chaos of retreat. The other women had noticed the smell too. She could see it in the way they turned their heads toward the kitchen with involuntary hunger, in the swallowing that indicated saliva gathering in mouths that had grown accustomed to being dry. Beside her walked Frida Bachmann, a 32-year-old nurse from Hamburg, whose capable hands and calm demeanor had made her a natural authority during their transport. Frida still clutched her medical bag to her chest, despite having been searched multiple times during processing. The bag contained only basic supplies, now most of her equipment having been confiscated, but she carried it like a talisman of her former purpose. Without looking at Elsa, Frida whispered in German, her voice barely audible above the sound of their footsteps on gravel. "Do you think they will starve us? It is what we would do to them." Else had no answer. She had heard stories about Allied treatment of prisoners, most of them from German propaganda, that she no longer trusted after everything she had witnessed during the retreat. But she also knew what German camps did to their prisoners. She had heard whispers, seen things that made her look away, because looking directly would have required action she was too afraid to take. And the thought that Americans might respond with equal brutality seemed entirely reasonable, given what Germany had done in this war. They would find out soon enough what kind of captivity awaited them. The women were given 30 minutes to settle into their assigned bunks before being summoned to the mess hall. Elsie had expected to be left in the barracks for processing, perhaps given watery soup and hard bread if they were fortunate enough to receive anything at all on their first day. Instead, an American corporal appeared at their door and gestured for them to follow him. He was young, could not have been older than 26, with dark eyes and the kind of easy smile that suggested he had not yet seen enough of war to have it beaten out of him. His expression was neutral but not unkind, and he walked slowly enough that the exhausted women could keep pace without struggling. The mess hall was warm. The heat from a large pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated through the space like a physical presence, and Elsie felt herself drawn toward it involuntarily. Long tables with benches filled the room, and at one end she could see a serving line where American soldiers were receiving their meals with the casual efficiency of routine. Her first thought was that the prisoners would eat separately, perhaps after the Americans had finished receiving whatever leftovers remained. But the corporal led them directly to the serving line, handing each woman a metal tray and utensils, as if they were simply other soldiers waiting for their dinner, rather than defeated enemies being fed out of legal obligation. Else stood behind Hilda Wagner in line, a 28-year-old clerk from Berlin who had kept a small pencil stub hidden in her uniform pocket, as if maintaining records might somehow preserve her sense of purpose. Else watched as the woman ahead of them received her portion. The American cook was a heavy-set man, with flour dusting his apron like fresh snow on dark fabric. He ladled thick soup into a bowl and placed it on Hilda's tray with practiced efficiency. Then he added a piece of bread. Not the hard, dark bread of German rations, but soft white bread that looked impossibly fresh, steam rising from where it had been sliced. Then butter. A pat of real butter, yellow and rich. Then a cup of what appeared to be actual coffee, not the chicory substitute they had been drinking for years, but coffee that smelled like the word itself, dark and promising. Hilda stood frozen, staring at her tray as if unable to process what she was seeing. The moment stretched until the cook made a gentle gesture encouraging her to move along so others could be served. When Elsie reached the serving line, she watched the cook's hands as he filled her bowl. The soup was pale thick with potatoes and cream studded with bits of bacon and onions. Steam rose from its surface, carrying a scent that made her mouth water so intensely it became almost painful. She had not seen soup this thick since before the war, since her mother's kitchen in Stuttgart still had access to proper ingredients. Even during the early years of the conflict, when Germany was still winning and the propaganda promised imminent victory, rations had been carefully controlled. Resources directed to the front. Sacrifices demanded of everyone. This single bowl contained more food than she had eaten in the past 3 days combined. More protein, more fat, more substance. The weight of it on her tray felt obscene. The cook looked at her and seemed to notice her staring. He smiled not unkindly and said something in English that she did not understand. His tone was friendly, almost apologetic, as if embarrassed that the food might not be good enough. Then he ladled an additional portion into her bowl, filling it nearly to the rim until the soup threatened to spill over the edges. Elsa's hands shook as she carried her tray to the nearest table. Around her, the other German women sat in stunned silence, looking at their meals as if they might disappear at any moment. No one ate. They simply stared at the impossible abundance before them, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with everything they had been told about American deprivation and suffering. The propaganda had been so clear. America was collapsing under the strain of war. Their economy was broken. Their people were starving while their government poured resources into foreign conflicts. These were facts that had been repeated so often they had become indistinguishable from truth. But this soup made a liar of every broadcast Elsie had ever heard. Frida was the first to break the silence. She picked up her spoon with trembling fingers and dipped it into the pale soup, watching the thick liquid coat the metal. Then she brought it to her lips and tasted. Her eyes closed. For a moment, her entire body seemed to sag with something that looked like grief. When she opened her eyes again, tears were streaming down her face. She was not crying from sadness. This was something else entirely. The overwhelming shock of tasting real food after so many months of deprivation. The sensory overload of flavors that her body had almost forgotten existed. Cream and butter and bacon and the simple earthy comfort of properly cooked potatoes. The sight of Frida's tears seemed to give the others permission to eat. Elsa lifted her own spoon and tasted the soup. The flavors exploded across her tongue with an intensity that felt almost painful. Creamy potatoes that had been cooked until they dissolved into the broth. Rich butter that coated her mouth. Smoky bacon that tasted like luxury itself. The sharp bite of onions that had been caramelized until they were sweet and complex. All of it combined into something that seemed impossibly luxurious. This was not survival food. This was not ration distribution. This was a meal designed to nourish and satisfy, and perhaps even bring pleasure. The concept felt foreign after so many months of eating only to delay starvation. Around the table, the German women ate in silence, but it was a different silence than before. This was the concentrated quiet of people experiencing something profound, something that challenged everything they had believed about their enemies and themselves. Elsa watched Greta Klein, the youngest among them, at 19, eating her bread with such careful attention that each bite seemed like a meditation. The girl had been rail thin when they boarded the transport ship, her uniform hanging loose on her frame, her face all sharp angles and shadows. Now she ate as if trying to memorize the sensation of having enough food, as if committing to memory what it felt like when your stomach stopped hurting from emptiness. The American soldiers in the mess hall went about their meals with casual indifference to the abundance surrounding them. They chatted with each other, laughed at jokes that Elsa could not understand, gestured with forks that carried food they sometimes put back down without eating. Some even left food on their trays when they finished scraping portions into waste bins, as if excess were simply the expected outcome of any meal. Elsa found this last detail almost obscene. In Germany, leaving food uneaten had become unthinkable. Every crumb was precious. Every scrap was saved and repurposed. Children were taught that wasting food was not just foolish, but morally wrong, a betrayal of the collective sacrifice. But these Americans treated plenty as if it were ordinary, as if thick potato soup and fresh bread and real butter were simply the expected standard rather than unattainable luxuries. They ate without guilt, without the constant awareness that others were going hungry. They consumed as if abundance were their birthright. Captain Anderson entered the mess hall and walked slowly between the tables, observing the German prisoners as they ate. She stopped near Elsa's table and, through the translator who had accompanied her, she asked a question. Is the food acceptable? The translator's German was formal and stilted, the grammar technically correct, but missing the natural rhythm of native speakers. Still, the meaning was clear enough. Else looked up at the captain, searching for sarcasm or mockery in her expression. Some indication that this was a test or a trap, that the question was designed to elicit gratitude that could later be weaponized. But she found none of that. The question had been asked in genuine concern, as if the captain actually cared whether her prisoners found their meal satisfactory. Else managed to speak, her voice rough from disuse and emotion. It is, she paused, searching for adequate words in her limited English vocabulary. It is thick. The translator relayed this to Captain Anderson, who looked confused by the statement. The word thick seemed inadequate to convey what Elsie was trying to express, but she could not explain in English what she meant, could not articulate that the thickness of the soup represented everything that separated American abundance from German scarcity, that in those two syllables she was trying to express her complete disorientation at discovering that her enemies ate like kings while her own people starved, that the texture of the soup, the way a spoon could stand upright in it, was proof that she had been lied to about everything. That first night in the barracks, none of the women could sleep despite their exhaustion. They lay in their bunks, staring at the ceiling, or whispering to each other in the darkness, trying to process what they had experienced. The meal had shaken something fundamental in their understanding of the war and their place in it. It had introduced a crack in the foundation of certainty they had built their lives upon. And through that crack, and uncomfortable questions were beginning to seep in like water through damaged stone. Else listened to the conversations floating through the room, hearing the same confusion and disbelief echoed in every voice. Hilda de Wagner, ever the administrator, tried to apply logic to the situation. Perhaps it was special treatment, she suggested from her bunk near the window. Perhaps they feed us well at first to make us compliant, and then the rations will decrease to normal prisoner levels. A strategy to gain cooperation through temporary generosity. But even as she spoke, her voice carried doubt. The American soldiers had eaten the same food from the same kitchen with the same casual abundance. This was not special treatment designed to manipulate prisoners. This was simply how they ate. This was normal. Greta Klein, whose youth had not yet been completely hardened by cynicism, asked the question that everyone was thinking but afraid to voice. What if everything we were told about America was a lie? The words hung in the darkness like an accusation, like a door opening onto a room they were terrified to enter. They had been taught that Americans were suffering under their war effort, that their economy was collapsing, that their people were starving while their government poured resources into foreign conflicts they could not win. The thick potato soup and fresh bread suggested a very different reality. Else thought about the years of propaganda broadcasts she had heard. The newsreels showing American poverty and desperation. The speeches promising that Germany's enemies were on the verge of collapse, that victory was merely a matter of will and sacrifice. She had believed it all because believing had been easier than questioning, because doubt was dangerous, because the penalty for skepticism could be severe. But now, lying in a clean American barracks with a full stomach for the first time in months, she could not ignore the evidence of her own experience, could not pretend that her senses were deceiving her. The soup had been real, the bread had been real, the casual abundance had been undeniably, impossibly real. If they had lied about American scarcity, what else had been a lie? Frida spoke from across the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone older and more experienced than most of the others. Her 32 years felt ancient compared to Greta's 19. I worked in hospitals during the retreat, she said quietly. I saw what we did to our own soldiers when we ran out of supplies. We left them behind. We abandoned the wounded because we could not feed them. The decision was made not from cruelty, but from cold calculation. Limited resources required impossible choices. She paused, and Elsie heard her shift in her bunk, the springs creaking with the movement. These Americans feed their prisoners better than we fed our own men. The observation settled over the room like a weight pressing down on their chests. It was one thing to acknowledge that American abundance exceeded their expectations. It was another thing entirely to confront the reality that their own government had chosen scarcity, had prioritized ideology over the basic care of its people and soldiers. The soup had been thick, yes, but its thickness revealed something much more disturbing than simple plenty. It revealed the vast gulf between what they had been told and what was actually true. It revealed that their sacrifices had been built on foundations of lies, that their hunger had not been necessary, that someone somewhere had decided they were worth less than the propaganda required them to believe. And if that gulf existed regarding something as basic as food, how many other lies remained to be discovered? The question kept Elsie awake long into the night, staring at shadows on the ceiling and wondering what else she would learn in this place. What other certainties would dissolve like sugar in hot water? What other foundations would crack and crumble under the weight of evidence her eyes could not deny? She thought about her mother in Stuttgart, dead now in an air raid according to the last letter she had received before her capture. She thought about her brother Wilhelm missing somewhere on the Eastern Front, his fate unknown and unknowable. She thought about the factory where she had worked producing components for weapons that had not saved Germany from defeat. And she thought about that bowl of soup, thick and creamy and abundant, proof that everything she had sacrificed for had been built on lies. The morning brought work assignments. Captain Anderson, through her translator, explained that the Geneva Convention required prisoners of war be given meaningful work, that the camp operated under strict adherence to international law. The women would be assigned tasks based on their skills and experience, and they would work alongside American personnel in various capacities. Elsie found herself assigned to the camp's administrative office, her basic literacy in English having been noted during processing. The assignment felt almost surreal. She would be handling paperwork for the very system that held her captive, filing forms and organizing records as if she were simply another clerk rather than a defeated enemy. The administrative office was a small building near the main gate heated by a wood stove that kept the space comfortably warm. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and several desks held typewriters that looked well-maintained and frequently used. Everything was organized with military precision, but there was none of the frantic chaos that had characterized German administrative work or during the final months of the war. Corporal Joseph Rossi supervised the office with relaxed efficiency. He was Italian-American from Boston with dark hair and eyes that suggested Mediterranean ancestry. When he spoke to Elsie, he did so slowly, enunciating his words carefully so she could follow his meaning, showing her how to organize supply requisition forms according to the camp's filing system, explaining procedures with patience that surprised her. She had expected to be treated as a burden, as unwanted labor forced upon busy soldiers who resented the extra work of supervision. Instead, Rossi seemed genuinely interested in helping her understand her tasks. He corrected her mistakes without condescension, praised her improvements with sincerity, and created an atmosphere that felt more like training than punishment. During the mid-morning break, Rossi produced a thermos of coffee and 2 cups. He poured coffee for both of them without asking if she wanted any, then pushed a small tin across the desk toward her. Inside were cookies, homemade by his wife Maria. He explained through gestures and simple English words, pointing to a photograph on his desk that showed a smiling woman in a kitchen. Elsa stared at the cookies, these casual luxuries that represented yet another example of American abundance. In Germany, sugar had been rationed for years. Butter was precious, hoarded, and measured. The idea of baking cookies for mere pleasures seemed almost obscene, a waste of resources that could have been used for more essential purposes. She took one cookie, biting into it carefully. The sweetness was overwhelming, almost too much after months of bland rations and the constant background taste of hunger. Sugar and butter and vanilla combined into flavors so rich they made her teeth ache. Rossi watched her reaction with amusement, then said something in English that included the word sweet, in a gesture that suggested he understood her shock. He was not mocking her. He was sharing the moment with genuine warmth, as if her amazement was something delightful rather than pathetic. Then he did something that broke through all of Elsie's carefully constructed emotional defenses. He pulled out a photograph from his wallet and showed it to her. His wife Maria, round-faced and smiling, stood in a kitchen holding a mixing bowl. 2 small children clung to her skirts, both grinning at the camera with the unself-conscious joy that only children could manage. Else looked at the photograph and felt something crack inside her chest. This enemy soldier was not a monster from propaganda films. He was not the cruel barbarian that German broadcasts had promised awaited any soldier unlucky enough to fall into American hands. He was a man who carried pictures of his family, who shared cookies baked by his wife, who spoke slowly so a German prisoner could understand him, who smiled when she got the filing system right and gently corrected her when she made mistakes. She thought of her own family in Stuttgart, of her mother who had once baked cookies before the war made such luxuries impossible, of her younger brother Wilhelm, who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and whose fate remained unknown. Wilhelm had been 20 when he left for the Eastern Front, carrying photographs of their family, just as Rossi carried pictures of his. Rossi was not so different from Wilhelm. Both of them young men caught up in something larger than themselves, both trying to survive while maintaining some connection to the people and places that defined who they were beneath their uniforms. She managed to say thank you in English, the words awkward in her mouth, her accent thick and uncertain. But Rossi understood. He smiled and nodded, then went back to his paperwork as if sharing cookies with an enemy prisoner was the most natural thing in the world. Else ate the cookie, slowly tasting not just the sweetness, but also the bitter realization that she had been fighting against people who were fundamentally human, who had families and kindnesses and ordinary lives that existed beyond the framework of war and hatred. The propaganda had made it easier to be a soldier by making the enemy into something less than human, into abstractions that could be hated without guilt. But thick soup and homemade cookies and family photographs were making that dehumanization impossible to maintain. And Elsie was beginning to understand that this was the most dangerous thing about her captivity. Not the threat of physical harm or degradation, but the slow dissolution of certainties she had built her identity upon. The gradual erosion of boundaries between enemy and human. The terrifying possibility that she had been wrong about everything. The second week brought a routine that began to feel almost normal. Wake at 6 in the morning. Breakfast in the mess hall where thick soup had been replaced by equally abundant oatmeal with brown sugar and cream. Work assignments until noon. Lunch that always included fresh bread and real butter. More work until 5. Dinner that varied but never failed to shock with its plenty. Then evening hours in the barracks where the women whispered to each other about the strange captivity they were experiencing. But within that routine, Elsie noticed something happening to the German women that none of them had anticipated. They were gaining weight, not dramatically, not obviously enough that anyone could point to a specific day when it became visible, but enough that uniforms that had hung loose now fit properly. Faces that had been gaunt were filling out. Energy that had been depleted was slowly returning. Frida mentioned it during their evening gathering in the barracks. She had been observing the women with her medical training, noting the changes that came from consistent nutrition. "We were starving," she said simply. Not all at once, not dramatically enough to recognize it as starvation, but slowly over years. We became so accustomed to hunger that we forgot what it felt like to have enough. The statement hung in the air, forcing each woman to confront a reality they had been avoiding. The German rations had been insufficient for so long that chronic malnutrition had become their normal state. They had adapted to deprivation until they no longer recognized it as abnormal. Else thought about the past 2 years in Stuttgart working in the factory. She remembered the constant fatigue that made every shift feel like swimming through deep water. The way her hands had trembled during delicate work. The difficulty concentrating on even simple tasks. The infections that would not heal. The coldness that seemed to come from inside her bones rather than from the winter air. She had attributed it to stress, to the demands of wartime production, to worry about her brother at the front and her mother alone in the city during bombing raids. Now she understood that much of it had been simple hunger. Her body had been slowly consuming itself, breaking down muscle and reserves to survive on inadequate rations. And she had been too indoctrinated, too afraid, too conditioned to recognize it for what it was. Greta Klein, who had been the thinnest among them, showed the most dramatic change. At 19, her body had still been trying to grow, even as it was being starved. 2 weeks of American meals had brought color back to her cheeks and steadiness to her movements that had been absent when they arrived. She confessed one evening that she had stopped menstruating 8 months earlier, her body shutting down non-essential functions to survive. She had thought it was normal that war made such things happen to women. Now, with proper nutrition, she wondered if her body might remember how to function normally again. The realization of how hungry they had been created a strange new shame among the prisoners. They had been proud German women serving the Reich, believing they were making necessary sacrifices for victory. But their sacrifice had been built on a foundation of governmental neglect, of leaders who had chosen to continue a war they could not win rather than adequately feed their people. Every thick soup, every piece of fresh bread, every meal that left them satisfied rather than still hungry served as evidence of how badly they had been failed by their own country. The Americans were not being exceptionally generous. They were simply feeding people properly. And that basic decency revealed the depths of German dysfunction. But not everyone accepted this revelation with quiet resignation. Sergeant Gertrude Hoffmann, who everyone called Trudy, had maintained a rigid distance from American kindness since their arrival. At 35, she was among the oldest of the prisoners, a senior clerk from Nuremberg, whose father had been a Nazi Party official. She carried herself with the bearing of someone who believed rank and ideology were more important than circumstances. Trudy had refused seconds at meals during the first week, insisting that they should maintain German discipline even in captivity. She had criticized the recipe card lessons that were beginning to form in the administrative office, calling them collaboration with the enemy. And she had gathered a small faction of 4 or 5 women who shared her view that accepting American abundance with pleasure was a betrayal of those still fighting. In the third week, Captain Anderson announced that prisoners would be permitted to send letters to family members in Germany through the International Red Cross. The women gathered in the common room with paper and pencils, facing the complicated task of trying to communicate across the vast distance that separated them from whatever remained of their former lives. Elsa sat with blank paper before her, pen in hand, struggling to find words that could bridge the gap between what she had been and what she was becoming. She began writing to her mother, then remembered with a physical pain in her chest that her mother was dead. Killed in an air raid 6 months ago, according to the neighbor's letter she had received just before her capture. So she wrote instead to that neighbor, Frau Dietrich, asking about the house, about whether anything remained of their belongings, about whether there had been any word from Wilhelm on the Eastern Front. She crafted careful sentences that would pass through military censors on both sides. She could not tell the truth about American abundance, could not describe the thick potato soup or the fresh bread or the coffee that tasted real. Such descriptions would be seen as propaganda, as attempts to undermine German morale, or worse, as evidence that she had become a traitor who praised the enemy while her countrymen suffered. So instead, she wrote bland reassurances about her health, vague statements about being treated according to international law, careful questions that might yield information without revealing how much her understanding of the world had shifted. Around the room, other women struggled with similar constraints. Hilda wrote to her sister in Berlin, her handwriting precise and controlled, revealing nothing of the emotional upheaval she was experiencing. Frida wrote to her parents in Hamburg, asking about their survival of the bombing raids that had devastated the city. Greta wrote to her grandmother, the only family member whose location she knew with certainty, filling her letter with reassurances she did not entirely feel. The letters were collected by Captain Anderson and sent through proper channels to the Red Cross. Then came the waiting. Weeks of uncertainty about whether the letters would reach their destinations, whether the addresses they had written would lead to buildings that no longer existed, whether the people they hoped to contact were still alive. Mail from Germany was irregular and heavily censored, filtered through multiple military bureaucracies before reaching the small camp in Massachusetts. The women checked for letters every day, hoping for connection to the lives they had left behind. When responses finally began arriving in late December, they brought news that was almost universally devastating. Else received a brief note from Frau Dietrich confirming that the house in Stuttgart was destroyed, that the factory where Elsa had worked was rubble, that there had been no word from Wilhelm in over a year. The neighbor was leaving the city, going to stay with relatives in the countryside where there might be food. She did not know if she would return. Elsa read the letter 3 times, trying to absorb information that rendered her entire previous existence into past tense. She was not just a prisoner of war anymore. She was a woman with no home to return to, no family waiting, no job that needed her. Nothing of her former life remained intact except memories that grew less reliable with each passing day. Similar news arrived for others. Frida learned that her parents were living in the rubble of their bombed-out home in Hamburg, surviving on charity and whatever food they could scavenge. Hilda discovered that her sister had been killed during the Soviet advance into Berlin. Greta's grandmother wrote that she was alone, too old to work, surviving on the kindness of neighbors who had little enough themselves. Each letter brought confirmation that Germany was not just defeated, but devastated, that the country they remembered no longer existed except as ruins and refugees, and the hollow-eyed survivors of a catastrophe that had consumed everything. The thick American soup took on new meaning after those letters arrived. It was not just better than German rations. It was sustenance in a world where the alternative might be nothing at all. It was proof that staying in captivity might be safer than returning to freedom in a country that could not feed its own people. Corporal Puisi noticed Elsa's withdrawn demeanor after she received her letter from Germany. He did not ask intrusive questions or demand explanations. Instead, he modified her work assignments to include tasks that required more concentration, more engagement with the present moment, rather than dwelling on a past that no longer existed. He began teaching her English through an unusual method, bringing in his wife Maria's recipe cards and using them as language lessons. Each recipe became a vocabulary exercise, a grammar lesson, and a window into American domestic life that existed far from battlefields and prisoner camps. The first recipe was for apple pie. Rossi read it aloud slowly while Elsie followed along on her own copy, sounding out unfamiliar words with careful attention. Peel core slice. Mix sugar and cinnamon. Roll dough into crust. Bake until golden and bubbling. The instructions were simple, but they contained depths of cultural information that Elsie was only beginning to understand. Americans had enough sugar to bake pies for pleasure. They had enough butter for pastry that served no nutritional purpose beyond taste. They had enough apples to use 6 or 8 in a single dessert rather than eating them one at a time as precious treats. Each ingredient was an accusation against the propaganda she had believed. Each step in the process revealed abundance, so casual it seemed almost obscene. Rossi explained that his wife Maria had learned these recipes from her own mother, who had learned them from hers. The family had come from Campania in southern Italy 3 generations ago, and food was how they maintained connection to their heritage while building new lives in America. He spoke about Sunday dinners where 3 generations gathered around tables that groaned under the weight of too much food, about the importance of teaching children to cook traditional foods so they would remember where they came from, about how recipes carried memories and identity across time and distance. Else listened and began to understand that American abundance was not just about having enough. It was about having enough to share enough, to celebrate enough, to preserve cultural traditions through food. It was about treating plenty as something that should be used to create joy rather than merely prevent suffering. As her English improved through these culinary lessons, Elsa found herself sharing German recipes in return. She taught Rossi about her mother's Kartoffelpuffer, the potato pancakes that had been a staple of her childhood before the war made such simple pleasures impossible. About Christmas Stollen, the rich bread studded with dried fruits and nuts that her grandmother had made every December until sugar became too scarce. About the cabbage soups that had sustained them through winters when there was little else. The act of translating recipes forced her to think carefully about vocabulary and grammar. But it also forced her to remember a Germany that had existed before the war, before the shortages, before the propaganda had poisoned everything with ideology and hatred. There had been a time when her mother's kitchen smelled of baking bread, when food was about family and tradition rather than survival. Other prisoners noticed the recipe exchanges and asked to join. Soon a small group gathered in the administrative office, during breaks sharing food memories and learning English through the universal language of cooking. Frida contributed recipes from her medical training, explaining nutrition and proper diet with professional precision. Hilda shared her grandmother's Viennese cake recipes from the peaceful years before Austria had been absorbed into the Reich. Greta, whose family had been poor even before the war, learned about foods she had never tasted, but could now imagine through careful English descriptions. The recipe cards became a bridge between past and present, between German and American, between who they had been and who they might become. And with each recipe translated, each ingredient discussed, their English grew stronger and their connection to their former lives grew more complicated. But Trudy watched these sessions with disapproval that hardened into active opposition. She stood in the doorway one afternoon, observing as Elsie and Frida laughed over a mistranslation that had turned dumplings into clouds. When the laughter died down, Trudy spoke in German, her voice sharp with accusation. "You trade our heritage for enemy approval. You learn their language as if you plan to stay. You cook their food and laugh at their jokes. When we return to Germany, you will be suspected collaborators. People will ask what you did to earn such comfortable captivity." Else felt the words land like stones, heavy and bruising. but she forced herself to meet Trudy's eyes and respond quietly. I am learning English because ignorance serves no purpose. I am sharing recipes because food is not political. And I am laughing because humor is not treason. Trudy's expression remained cold and certain. You were always weak, Schneider. Even in the factory, you questioned things you should have accepted. Now you collaborate because it is easier than maintaining dignity. The accusation stung precisely because it contained a grain of truth. Elsa had questioned. She had doubted. She had noticed inconsistencies in the propaganda that others seemed to accept without hesitation. And now she was allowing American kindness to erode her loyalty to a country that had failed her in every possible way. But was that weakness? Or was it simply facing reality instead of clinging to comfortable lies? December arrived with snow that transformed the camp into something almost peaceful. The war in Europe continued grinding toward its inevitable conclusion, but within the compound's wire fences, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Captain Anderson announced that Christmas would be celebrated with a special meal, and she asked the German prisoners if they would like to contribute by preparing some traditional foods. The request caught the women off guard. They were prisoners being asked to participate in their captors' holiday celebration, to share their culture with people they were supposed to hate. Elsa found herself volunteering along with Frida, Greta, and 6 others. Trudy's faction refused, calling the participation a betrayal of those still fighting. But the majority of the women were willing to try, curious about what might happen when German and American traditions met in a camp kitchen. The American cooks welcomed them with surprising enthusiasm, clearing workspace and listening intently as the German women explained traditional recipes through a mixture of English gestures and Rossi's translations. The camp's supply officer had somehow acquired ingredients that seemed impossible. Butter in quantities they had not seen in years. Sugar that sparkled white and pure. Dried fruits that had been luxuries even before the war. Spices that filled the kitchen with sense of childhood in memory. When Elsa asked where such luxuries came from during wartime, the supply sergeant shrugged and said simply that it was Christmas, as if that explained everything. As if the holiday itself was sufficient justification for abundance. The preparation took 3 days. The German women worked alongside American soldiers in the kitchen, their shared focus on food temporarily erasing the boundary between captor and captive. They made Stollen, the traditional German Christmas bread, heavy with fruits and nuts and rich with butter. They prepared Lebkuchen, spiced cookies that filled the kitchen with scents that transported Elsa back to her childhood in Stuttgart. She stood at the counter folding butter into dough, and for a moment she was 8 years old again, standing on a stool beside her mother's stove, watching with fascination as ordinary ingredients transformed into something magical through heat and time and careful attention. The memory was so vivid, it made her chest ache. They created marzipan decorations, shaping the almond paste into delicate forms that seemed too beautiful to eat. And through it all, they taught the American cooks, shared techniques and stories, laughed at mistakes, and celebrated successes. The kitchen became a space where nationality mattered less than the universal language of creating food together. But Staff Sergeant Mitchell watched from the doorway with his notebook open, recording every detail. He wrote down ingredient quantities, noted the laughter and the easy camaraderie, documented the way enemy prisoners and American soldiers worked side by side as if they were simply people making Christmas treats together. He was not angry. His expression remained carefully neutral, almost bureaucratic. But Elsie saw him writing and understood that he was building something. Evidence of excessive comfort. Proof that the camp was exceeding Geneva Convention requirements. Documentation that might eventually lead to consequences she could not yet imagine. The evening before Christmas, Trudy confronted the volunteers in the barracks. You bake for them with smiles, she said, her voice carrying through the quiet room. You laugh with the guards while Germany burns. You will return home as traitors if you return at all. They will ask what you did to earn such kindness from the enemy, and you will have no good answer. Else met her gaze and spoke quietly but clearly. I have no home to betray anymore. My mother is dead. My brother is missing. My house is rubble. The Germany I knew is gone. What exactly am I supposed to be loyal to? Trudy's expression hardened. Then you are already dead to Germany. You have chosen comfort over honor. Perhaps Elsie said, or perhaps I have chosen truth over lies. We were told Americans were barbarians who would torture us. Instead, they feed us better than our own government did. We were told America was collapsing. Instead, we see abundance we never knew in Germany. Every meal here proves we were deceived, and I will not pretend otherwise just to maintain loyalty to leaders who built everything on lies. The words created a division in the barracks that would never fully heal. Some women nodded in quiet agreement. Others looked away uncomfortable with such direct confrontation. Trudy turned and walked to her bunk without another word, her faction following her like a small procession of the faithful, maintaining their convictions in the face of heresy. But the stolen baked overnight, filling the barracks with a scent that haunted dreams. Some women dreamed of home. Others dreamed of something they had never had: abundance, without guilt, celebration, without fear, the freedom to choose joy, even in captivity. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow in a transformed mess hall. Pine branches decorated the walls, and paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling, created by American soldiers who seemed to approach the holiday with genuine enthusiasm. Long tables were set with actual tablecloths borrowed from local families who had donated them for the occasion. The American soldiers sat interspersed with German prisoners, no longer separated by nationality, but gathered as a community sharing a meal. The food arrived in waves of impossible abundance. Turkey so large that Elsie had trouble believing it came from a single bird. Ham glazed with brown sugar and studded with cloves, the surface caramelized and glistening. Mashed potatoes swimming in butter and cream, whipped until they were lighter than clouds. Vegetables that had been carefully preserved from the autumn harvest. Fresh rolls and the German stollen they had prepared sitting side by side as if cuisines could coexist without conflict. And desserts. So many desserts it seemed wasteful. Apple pies made from Maria Rossi's recipe. German Lebkuchen arranged on plates like edible art. Cream in pitchers for pouring. Sugar for sprinkling. Abundance piled on abundance until the table seemed to groan under the weight. Captain Anderson stood to offer a brief speech before the meal began. She spoke about gratitude for having enough to share, about the privilege of abundance that should never be taken for granted, about the hope that even in wartime moments of peace and plenty could remind everyone of their common humanity. Then she did something unexpected. She asked Elsie to respond on behalf of the German prisoners, to share their thoughts about this unusual Christmas celebration so far from their homeland. Elsie stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She had not expected to speak publicly, had not prepared any words, and found herself facing a room full of people who waited with genuine interest for what she might say. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She spoke in careful English, her accent thick, but her grammar improving after weeks of practice with Rossi and the recipe cards. Her voice wavered at first, then grew stronger as she found the words she needed. Thank you, Captain Anderson, for treatment following Geneva Convention. Not just in letter, but in spirit. But this meal, she gestured at the laden tables, makes us ashamed. Not ashamed of you. Ashamed of what we believed about you. We were told Americans were weak, that you were suffering, that you were enemies who deserved destruction. But you feed us better than our own country fed us. You treat us with dignity we did not earn. You show kindness we do not deserve. She felt tears beginning, but refused to let them fall. We ate propaganda along with our thin soup in Germany. We swallowed lies because we were too hungry to question them. Now we sit at your table with more food than we have seen in years, and we must face truth that everything we believed was false. This abundance, she paused, searching for the right English word, this plenty that you treat as normal, it shows us how badly we were deceived. She looked around at the other German prisoners. Frida was crying openly, tears streaming down her face without shame. Greta stared at her plate as if the food had become accusatory. Hilda gripped her napkin with white-knuckled intensity. Even some of Trudy's faction looked shaken, their certainty wavering in the face of such honest reckoning. When we return to Germany after the war, Else continued, if we return, we will remember this Christmas. We will remember that American soldiers shared abundance with prisoners who had been taught to hate them. We will remember that kindness is stronger than propaganda. She sat down abruptly, her brief eloquence exhausted, unsure if she had said too much or revealed too deeply the transformation happening inside her. Captain Anderson's response was simple and direct. She raised her glass of cider and proposed a toast, not to victory or defeat, but to the hope that wars would end and people could learn to see each other clearly without the distortions of hatred and propaganda. The toast was drunk by Americans and Germans alike, a small gesture of shared humanity in the middle of a conflict that still raged across two continents. Then they ate the abundance on the table, serving as both celebration and indictment, pleasure and guilt intermingled in every bite. Winter deepened into 1945, and with the new year came increasingly clear signs that Germany's defeat was inevitable. News filtered into the camp through American radio broadcasts and newspapers that the prisoners were now permitted to read. The Eastern Front had collapsed completely. Allied forces were advancing into Germany itself, encountering resistance that grew more desperate and futile with each passing day. Cities that the women remembered from their childhoods were being systematically destroyed, reduced to rubble and ash. The Third Reich that they had served, however misguidedly, was dying in spectacular fashion, and the question of what came next began to surface in conversations among the prisoners with increasing urgency. But before that future could be confronted, the camp faced a crisis that would test everything the women had learned about American principles. Late January brought a blizzard that buried Massachusetts under snow so deep the roads became impassable. Supply trucks that normally arrived twice weekly could not reach Camp Clinton. The carefully maintained abundance that had shocked the German prisoners into questioning everything suddenly faced its first real challenge. Captain Anderson called a staff meeting on the third day of the storm. Else, working in the administrative office, could hear raised voices through the thin walls. Staff Sergeant Mitchell's voice carried clearly sharp with conviction. "Ma'am, if we're rationing, prisoners should receive reduced portions. Geneva Convention requires adequate care, not equal treatment during shortages. Our soldiers' needs come first." Anderson's response was measured but firm. "The convention requires equal treatment, Sergeant. We ration everyone equally, or we violate the treaty we're sworn to uphold. With respect, ma'am, our soldiers work harder. They deserve priority. The treaty doesn't make exceptions based on who we think deserves more, Sergeant. We follow the rules or we become no better than the enemy we're fighting." The argument continued, but Anderson's position held. When she addressed the entire camp that evening, Americans and prisoners assembled together, her announcement was clear. All personnel would receive the same reduced rations until supply lines reopened. No exceptions, no preferential treatment. The law applied equally, or it applied to no one. Some American guards grumbled quietly. Else heard fragments of complaint. "Why should Krauts eat the same as us? They're prisoners, not guests." But orders were orders, and the rationing began. The thick potato soup disappeared, replaced by thinner broths. Fresh bread became a distant memory. Butter vanished. Coffee stretched further with each pot. The abundance that had become normal over 2 months was suddenly sharply absent. And Else watched with fascination as the American soldiers adapted to scarcity with the same casual acceptance they had shown toward plenty. They complained, yes, but they shared their reduced portions without resentment. They made jokes about thin soup and hard biscuits. They treated rationing as an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe, because they knew it was temporary, because they had never lived through the kind of chronic deprivation that made every meal feel like it might be the last adequate one, because abundance was their expectation and shortage was merely an interruption. On the fifth night of reduced rations, Elsa gathered the German women in the barracks for a discussion. Frieda, Greta, Hilda, even some of Trudy's faction attended, drawn by curiosity about what Schneider wanted to propose. Elsie spoke in German, her voice quiet but clear. "They are still feeding us equally, even when they don't have to, even when it costs them comfort. Captain Anderson could justify giving us less, and no one would question it, but she chooses to follow the treaty precisely." Frieda nodded slowly. "In Germany, we left wounded behind when supplies ran low. We abandoned our own soldiers because we could not feed them. The decision was strategic," they said, "necessary for the greater good. And these Americans," Greta added, her young voice carrying wonder, "they could take more for themselves. They could justify it easily." "But they don't," Else took a breath. "I propose we offer to reduce our portions more than the Americans. We are prisoners who do lighter work. They are guards who patrol in cold weather. We should volunteer to take smaller shares so supplies last longer for those who need them most." Trudy stood abruptly. "This is collaboration. You want to prove loyalty to captors by starving ourselves." "This is exactly what I warned against," Noel said firmly. "This is recognizing that they have shown us principle even when it costs them. This is acknowledging that their Geneva Convention means something real, not just words. And this is proving that we understand the difference between kindness and weakness. The discussion continued for an hour, voices rising and falling in the cold barracks. In the end, 15 women agreed with Elsa's proposal. 6, including Trudy, refused. But 15 was enough. The next morning, Elsie approached Captain Anderson through the translator. Captain, the German prisoners wish to offer a request. We would like to reduce our portions more than the American soldiers. You are guards who work harder in difficult conditions. We should take smaller shares, so supplies last longer. Anderson's expression showed genuine surprise, then something that looked like being moved despite her professional demeanor. I appreciate the offer, Miss Schneider. Truly, but I must decline. The treaty requires equal treatment. I cannot accept voluntary starvation from prisoners under my care, no matter how well-intentioned. We all eat equally, or I have failed my duty. Elsa understood then that this was not strategy. This was not propaganda designed to win cooperation. This was principle so deeply held that Anderson would rather suffer personally than violate it. The Americans followed rules even when it cost them comfort, even when no one would know if they bent those rules just slightly in their own favor. The blizzard ended on the 10th day. Supply trucks arrived with fresh provisions and thick soup returned to the mess hall. But it tasted different to Elsa now, not because the recipe had changed, but because she understood that American abundance was not propaganda or manipulation or temporary generosity. It was principle. It was a choice to treat plenty as something that should be shared rather than hoarded. It was a fundamental belief that rules mattered even when, especially when following them was difficult. And watching Trudy eat her full portion of restored soup with visible conflict on her face, Else knew that even the most rigid certainty was beginning to crack under the weight of evidence that could not be denied. March arrived with the first hints of spring and news that made the war's end feel immediate rather than theoretical. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. Germany's defenses were collapsing on all fronts. The question was no longer if the Reich would fall, but when. In his small office, Staff Sergeant Mitchell sat alone reviewing newly arrived intelligence reports about the German prisoners under his supervision. These files contained detailed information about each woman's military service before capture, their roles, their units, their specific duties. Most were exactly what he expected: clerks, nurses, translators, support personnel who had enabled the war machine but had not directly participated in combat, until his eyes landed on one particular file. Schneider Elsa, age 24, factory worker, Stuttgart until 1943, recruited to Women's Auxiliary Corps, assigned to 19th Communications Support Unit, France Sector. Duties: signals operation, message relay, coordination, support for Atlantic operations. Mitchell's hands tightened on the paper. The 19th Communications Support Unit. He knew that designation. They had coordinated U-boat operations in the Atlantic sector. They had relayed weather data, convoy positions, target coordinates. They had been part of the intelligence network that enabled submarine attacks on Allied shipping. He opened his desk drawer with hands that trembled slightly. The photograph looked back at him. Sarah and Danny smiling in front of their Philadelphia row house. February 3rd, 1943. The SS Dorchester had been torpedoed by U-2-23 while traveling in a convoy that the 19th Communications Support Unit had been tracking. Elsa Schneider had not personally fired the torpedo that killed his family, but she had been part of the system that made that attack possible. She had helped provide the information that enabled a submarine commander to find and destroy a ship carrying 672 civilians, including a woman who was just visiting her sister and a 9-year-old boy who collected toy submarines because he thought they were fascinating. Mitchell looked across the compound through his window. He could see the Elsie in the administrative office laughing with Corporal Rossi over some recipe card translation. The woman who had helped kill his family was learning to make lasagna. She was gaining weight on American food. She was smiling as if she had earned the right to joy. The rage that filled him was not hot or explosive. It was cold and methodical and absolutely certain. He had spent months watching these prisoners receive kindness they did not deserve. He had documented every excess, every moment of fraternization, every instance where compassion exceeded strict necessity. And now he knew that at least one of them bore direct responsibility for the worst thing that had ever happened to him. That night, Mitchell stood outside the women's barracks long after lights out. Through the window, he could see the Elsie sleeping peacefully, her face relaxed in a way that suggested dreams untroubled by guilt or awareness of what she had been part of. His service pistol sat on his hip, regulation issue cleaned and maintained according to protocol. His hand moved to the weapon, not to draw it, just to touch the solid metal that represented authority and order and the power to make decisions that mattered. He stood there for 90 seconds that felt like 90 years. 90 seconds of wrestling with grief so profound it had hollowed him out from the inside. 90 seconds of weighing justice against mercy, rage against protocol, the man he had been against the man he was becoming. She was part of it, his mind insisted. She helped them find the convoy. She relayed the information that enabled the attack. She bears responsibility for Sarah and Danny's deaths. But another voice, quieter but persistent, whispered different truths. She was 22 when it happened. She believed what she was told. She thought she was defending her country. She had no way of knowing the coordinates she relayed would be used to kill children. And if I punish her for crimes she did not personally commit, if I become the kind of man who executes prisoners for being part of a system they did not control, then what am I? What did Sarah and Danny die for if not the principle that we are better than this, that we follow rules even when it hurts, that we choose law over vengeance? Sweat formed on Mitchell's forehead despite the March cold. His hand remained on the pistol for another 30 seconds. Then with effort that felt like lifting something impossibly heavy, he dropped his hand and walked away. He returned to his quarters and opened his personal journal, not the official logbook where he had been documenting evidence against the prisoners, but the private record he kept for himself. She was part of it. They all were. But if I become what I think they are, if I let grief turn me into someone who punishes people for being cogs in a machine they did not build, then Margaret and Danny died for nothing. We're supposed to be better than hatred. That's the whole point of why we fight. That's what separates us from them. The next morning, Mitchell requested a meeting with Captain Anderson. He entered her office with the thick file he had been building for months. Documentation of every instance where he believed the camp had exceeded Geneva Convention minimums. Every extra blanket, every recipe card lesson, every moment of laughter between guards and prisoners. "Ma'am," he said, placing the file on her desk, "I've been building a case for stricter protocol enforcement. I believed we were being too lenient, treating enemy prisoners with excessive comfort." Anderson opened the file and began reading. Her expression remained neutral, but Mitchell could see her processing each documented incident. "But I need to withdraw it," he continued. His voice was steady but quiet. "I need to withdraw the recommendation because following the rules when it's hard is what makes them rules instead of suggestions. And I need to believe that rules matter. Otherwise, Sarah and Danny died in a world where nothing matters except who has the power to hurt who they hate." Anderson looked up at him with those steel gray eyes that had seen enough of war to understand both duty and mercy. "Why the change of heart, Sergeant? Because one of these prisoners helped kill my family. And I get to choose whether I become someone who uses that knowledge to justify revenge or someone who follows the law even when it costs me everything I want." Anderson was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "I'll note the withdrawal in the official record. And Sergeant, for what it's worth, I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm grateful for your choice." Mitchell left her office feeling emptied out, but somehow lighter. The grief remained, would always remain, but it no longer controlled his actions. He had chosen principle over vengeance. He had chosen to be the kind of man Sarah would have been proud of, rather than the kind Danny would have learned to fear. 2 days later, Anderson called Elsie to her office. The summons carried weight that made Elsa's stomach knot with familiar anxiety. Had she done something wrong? Was she being transferred? Had some new rule been implemented that she had unknowingly violated? But when she entered, Anderson's expression was thoughtful rather than stern. She gestured for Elsa to sit. "Miss Schneider, I want you to understand something about Sergeant Mitchell. He lost his wife and son when a U-boat torpedoed a civilian ship in February 1943. The intelligence that enabled that attack came from the 19th Communications Support Unit. Your unit." The words hit Elsie like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands gripped the arms of the chair to keep from swaying. "I didn't," she started, then stopped. What could she say? "I didn't know. I was just following orders. I thought I was defending Germany." All of it was true and none of it mattered. A woman was dead, a child was dead, and she had been part of the system that killed them. I know you didn't personally give the order, Anderson continued. I know you were relaying information you were told to relay. But I need you to understand what Sergeant Mitchell has chosen not to do with that knowledge. He has chosen to follow the law instead of his grief. He has chosen to treat you according to the Geneva Convention, despite knowing you bear some responsibility for the worst loss of his life. Why are you telling me this? Elsie managed to ask. Because you should know the cost of the mercy you have received. And because if you choose to stay in America after the war, which I suspect you're considering, you'll need a letter of reference. And Sergeant Mitchell has written one for you. Anderson slid a folded paper across the desk. Else took it with shaking hands and read words that blurred through tears she could not control. Miss Schneider has conducted herself with dignity and discipline throughout her time at this facility. She has worked diligently, learned quickly, and demonstrated genuine remorse upon learning the full scope of the regime she served. She will be an asset to any community that accepts her. At the bottom in Mitchell's careful handwriting, I write this not because I have forgotten what was taken from me, but because I choose to remember what I am fighting for. We are better than our worst moments. We must be, or everything is lost. Else could not speak, could not process the weight of mercy she was holding in her hands. She had helped kill this man's family, and he was helping her build a new life. Not because he had forgiven her, because forgiveness might be impossible, but because he believed in something larger than revenge. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The announcement came through the camp's radio system in the early afternoon. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Across America, church bells rang, and crowds filled streets with celebrations that would last for days. At Camp Clinton, the atmosphere was more complicated. For the American soldiers, it was relief and joy mixed with exhaustion and the knowledge that the war in the Pacific continued. For the German prisoners, it was mourning mixed with strange gratitude that the killing had finally stopped. Captain Anderson called a general assembly to announce repatriation procedures. The women gathered in the mess hall, Americans and Germans together one last time as captor and captive. Anderson explained that transportation would be arranged within weeks. The prisoners would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes. Her tone was formal, but carried an undertone that sounded almost like regret. These women had been her responsibility for months. She had watched them transform from hostile captives into something more complicated and human. And now she was required by international law to send them back to a devastated country that might kill them through simple deprivation, even though the war was over. But before she could finish explaining the procedures, Elsa stood up. Her heart was pounding so hard, she could feel it in her throat, but her voice was steady when she spoke in English that no longer required translation. Captain Anderson, may I speak for some of us? Permission was granted with a nod of curiosity. Else looked around at the other prisoners, making eye contact with Frida Greta and several others who had participated in the late-night discussions about their futures. Then she said words that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Some of us wish to request permission to remain in America rather than return to Germany. The statement created immediate confusion. American guards exchanged shocked glances. The translator seemed uncertain whether he had understood correctly. Captain Anderson's expression showed complete surprise. Even among the German prisoners, reactions varied from understanding nods to expressions of betrayal. Else continued before anyone could interrupt. We understand this is unusual. We know we are prisoners of war and that the Geneva Convention provides for our repatriation, but we ask you to consider our circumstances before making final decisions. 8 women stood slowly joining Elsa in her unprecedented request. Frida, whose medical skills had made her valuable to the camp's operations. Greta, who had found unexpected talent in mechanical repairs. Others whose names and skills had become familiar to the American personnel over months of daily interaction. They stood together, their faces showing fear and hope, in equal measure asking their former enemies for the extraordinary privilege of not returning to freedom in their own country. Frida spoke carefully in her improving English. Germany is not our home anymore. The Germany we served, we discovered, was not the Germany we believed in. We have no families living, no houses standing, no country that resembles what we remember. But here we have found something we never had in Germany: truth, dignity, the freedom to question without fear. The reaction in the room was stunned silence. This was a moment that had no precedent, no protocol, no clear answer. These women were asking to trade the certainty of repatriation for the uncertainty of remaining with the people who had been their enemies. And their request revealed just how completely the war had transformed everyone it touched. The request created immediate complications that extended far beyond Camp Clinton to Washington itself. Captain Anderson sent urgent communications to her superiors explaining the unprecedented situation. The women who had asked to stay were not hardened Nazi ideologues, but young working-class women who had been caught up in circumstances beyond their understanding. They had demonstrated genuine remorse about their country's actions and had integrated remarkably well into the camp's daily operations. Their request deserved serious consideration rather than automatic rejection. While waiting for official responses, life in the camp took on a strange quality of suspension. The 9 women who had asked to stay continued their work assignments with renewed intensity, as if their contributions might influence the decision being made hundreds of miles away. The 12 who had chosen repatriation watched with mixed feelings. Some were supportive, understanding that Germany offered nothing but ruins and starvation to return to. Others felt betrayed, as if the request to stay was an abandonment of German identity and a capitulation to the enemy. Hilda Wagner, who had decided to return despite having lost most of her family, confronted Else one evening in the barracks. "You are choosing comfort over duty. You are choosing thick soup over loyalty to your homeland." Elsie felt the sting of the words, but refused to accept the characterization. "I am choosing truth over lies. I am choosing a future over a past that never existed. Germany sent us to fight for something that was built on propaganda and cruelty. I will not return to serve a country that fed me lies while my enemies fed me honestly." "But Germany needs people who understand what we've learned here," Hilda insisted. "People who can help rebuild not just buildings, but values and systems. Running away to America feels like abandoning that responsibility." "Perhaps you're right," Else said quietly. "Perhaps I am taking the easier path. But I have learned that I am not strong enough to rebuild something from nothing. I am not brave enough to face starvation with dignity. I am only strong enough to admit that I would rather live with truth in a foreign country than die for lies in my homeland. And if that makes me a coward, then I accept that judgment." The debate continued throughout the barracks, revealing deep divisions about duty, identity, and the meaning of loyalty when your country has betrayed everything it promised to stand for. The decision from Washington arrived 1 week later, characteristically bureaucratic but unexpectedly flexible. The War Department would not prevent immediate repatriation for any prisoner who wished to return. However, given the unusual circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, those who wished to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status. It was not a guarantee, but it was possibility. And possibility was more than any of them had expected when they first arrived as defeated prisoners in that transport truck 6 months ago. The process of transitioning from prisoners of war to potential immigrants proved complex and bureaucratically challenging. The 9 women needed sponsors, American citizens or organizations willing to vouch for them and provide initial support as they attempted to build new lives. Captain Anderson worked with local church groups and community organizations to identify potential sponsors, but she also made it clear that sponsorship required more than paperwork. It required Americans willing to embrace former enemies as neighbors and colleagues. Mrs. Eleanor Bradford, a schoolteacher from Worcester who had been visiting the camp as part of a church outreach program, immediately offered to sponsor Elsa. She had been impressed by Elsa's intelligence and her rapid mastery of English through the recipe card lessons. More importantly, she had been moved by Elsa's genuine remorse about the revelations regarding Germany's actions during the war. "You are not responsible for things you never knew about," Mrs. Bradford told her during one of their conversations. "The question is what you do with the knowledge you have now, and I believe you'll do good things." Dr. William Harper, the camp's medical officer, arranged for Frida to continue her nursing training at Worcester General Hospital. Her careful attention to detail and natural empathy had impressed him during months of working together in the medical facility. "She has a gift for healing," he told Captain Anderson. "It would be waste to send her back to starve in rubble when she could be saving lives here." Greta found sponsorship through an unexpected source. Frank Coleman, a local mechanic, had heard about the young German woman who had discovered an unusual talent for repairing complicated machinery. His own sons had been killed in the Pacific Theater, and his wife had initially been hostile to the idea of helping a former enemy. But when Coleman met Greta and saw her work on a broken generator, fixing it with intuitive understanding of mechanical systems, he recognized genuine skill that transcended nationality. "She reminds me of my boys," he told his wife, "always taking things apart to see how they worked. Maybe helping her is a way of honoring what they died for." The idea that enemies can become people again. The other women who had requested to stay found similar paths forward. Each was creating a foothold in American society, building lives from the foundation of skills they had developed during their captivity. And each sponsorship represented an American family or organization willing to look past wartime propaganda and recognize the humanity in former enemies. Perhaps the most significant aspect of their transition was how food continued to play a central role in their integration. The families who sponsored them invariably invited them to shared meals, using the universal language of eating together to bridge cultural and linguistic gaps. Elsa's first dinner at the Bradford home featured both American pot roast and German Kartoffelpuffer that she had taught Mrs. Bradford to make using one of Rossi's recipe cards as translation guide. The meal became a symbol of their relationship, neither purely American nor purely German, but something new created from both the traditions. And every time Elsa sat down to abundant food, she remembered that first bowl of thick potato soup and how it had begun the process of transforming her understanding of everything she had believed about enemies and friends, truth and lies, home and belonging. June 20th, 1945 arrived with morning sunshine that seemed inappropriate for the weight of the occasion. The day marked the final repatriation of German prisoners from Camp Clinton, a moment that should have been purely administrative, but had evolved into something far more significant. The 12 women who had chosen to return to Germany gathered their few possessions and prepared for the journey back to an uncertain future. The atmosphere was heavy with complicated emotions that resisted simple categorization. Those leaving carried letters from American soldiers expressing respect and friendship. Photographs from their time at the camp showing Germans and Americans working side by side. Small gifts that had been given to them by guards and staff who had become something approaching friends. Most importantly, they carried recipe cards, both the ones they had learned from Americans and the ones they had shared from their own traditions, symbols of exchange that had meant more than any of them had expected. The farewell gathering in the mess hall was unlike any military proceeding that Captain Anderson had ever conducted. American soldiers who had guarded these women, worked alongside them, and gradually befriended them, now stood with obvious emotion as they said goodbye. Corporal Rossi had tears in his eyes as he hugged Elsa and wished her success in her new life. The gesture would have been unthinkable 6 months ago, a guard embracing an enemy prisoner. Now it seemed not just natural, but necessary. Dr. Harper shook Frida's hand formally, but his voice was rough when he told her she would make an excellent nurse and that America was fortunate to keep her. Even Staff Sergeant Mitchell appeared standing somewhat apart from the general gathering. He approached Elsa with the same careful control he had maintained throughout the months of her captivity. His expression was neutral, but his eyes held something that looked almost like peace. "Miss Schneider," he said quietly, "I wanted you to know that I meant what I wrote in that letter. You have a chance to build something good here. Don't waste it." Elsa felt tears threatening, but held them back through force of will. "Sergeant Mitchell, I cannot apologize enough for my part in what happened to your family. I know sorry is inadequate. I know nothing I do can change the past. But I promise you that I will try to honor your mercy by living a life that proves it was not wasted on someone unworthy." Mitchell nodded once sharply, then turned and walked away. He had given her what he could, which was the choice to follow law over vengeance. He could not give her absolution because some wounds did not heal, no matter how much time passed. But he could give her the chance to become someone different than who she had been. And that perhaps was enough. The women who were staying watched their friends board the transport vehicles that would take them to Boston, then to ships bound for Europe. Tears were shed on both sides, but they were tears of hope rather than despair. Both groups were embarking on journeys toward unknown futures, but they were journeys chosen rather than simply endured. The act of choosing after months of having no control over their circumstances felt powerful and transformative, in itself. Hilda was the last to board, pausing at the truck's entrance to look back at the camp that had been her prison and, paradoxically, her liberation. She caught Frida's eye across the compound and raised her hand in farewell. The gesture was returned, a moment of understanding passing between women who had traveled very different paths to reach the same realization about the importance of truth and dignity and the courage required to act on conviction, even when the cost was high. 20 years passed with the quiet accumulation of ordinary moments that build a life. Elsa Schneider became Elsa Bradford after marrying Robert Bradford, Mrs. Eleanor Bradford's nephew, who had returned from the Pacific Theater with his own complicated feelings about enemies and forgiveness. They built a home in Worcester, raised 3 children who spoke English without accents but learned German from their mother's bedtime stories. Else worked as a translator for the State Department, helping process the thousands of displaced persons who continued arriving from war-torn Europe long after the fighting stopped. The work felt like penance and purpose combined, using her language skills to help others navigate the same impossible transition she had made. Frida never married, dedicating her life instead to nursing. She became head nurse at Worcester General Hospital and was known for her particular compassion toward patients who had experienced trauma and displacement. She often said that her experience as a prisoner had taught her that healing required more than medical skill. It required recognizing the humanity in every person, regardless of their past or their circumstances. Greta married Frank Coleman 3 years after the war ended, after his wife passed away from illness. Their marriage raised eyebrows in the community, a union between a former enemy and a man who had lost his sons to that enemy. But their shared love of machinery and quiet understanding of loss created a bond that transcended wartime divisions. Greta eventually opened her own repair shop, becoming one of the few female mechanics in Massachusetts and earning respect through skill rather than sympathy. The 9 women who had stayed maintained close contact with each other over the years, gathering monthly for dinners where they spoke German and remembered the strange journey that had brought them to America. These gatherings always featured food, often the same thick potato soup that had first shocked them into recognizing American abundance. But now they made it themselves, teaching their children and grandchildren the recipe while telling stories about what that soup had meant when they first tasted it as hungry prisoners. The recipe became a family heirloom passed down with careful instructions and the explanation that food could change the world if it was shared with the right spirit. They also maintained correspondence with the women who had returned to Germany, creating a network of letters that spanned the Atlantic in the decades. Those who had gone back wrote about the challenges of rebuilding their lives in devastated cities, but also about how their experience in America had given them different perspectives that helped them navigate the complicated politics of occupation and Reconstruction. Several became leaders in German-American friendship societies, working to strengthen bonds between former enemies. The exchange of letters continued for decades, a testament to how the shared experience of that small prison camp had created connections that outlasted the war itself and meant more than any of them had anticipated. In 1965, Else received an invitation that would bring her story full circle. The United Nations was hosting a conference on reconciliation and post-war recovery, and they had requested her participation as someone who embodied the possibility of transformation between former enemies. She was asked to speak about her experience, to share how a bowl of soup and consistent kindness had changed the trajectory of her entire life. The United Nations conference room in New York was filled with diplomats, scholars, and survivors from conflicts around the world. Else stood at the podium feeling the weight of decades and the hope that maybe, just maybe, her story might help someone else understand that enemies could become people if you fed them honestly and treated them with dignity. She held 3 objects: the original recipe card that Corporal Rossi had used to teach her English Maria's apple pie recipe, written in fading ink; a photograph from that first Christmas dinner showing German prisoners and American soldiers cooking together; and her daughter's school essay from 15 years earlier titled My Mother's Journey from Enemy to American. Else began by describing that November day in 1944 when she had arrived at the prison camp expecting cruelty and finding instead a thick potato soup that challenged everything she believed. She spoke about how abundance, when offered without cruelty or condescension, could be more powerful than any weapon in breaking down the walls of hatred built by propaganda. The Americans did not defeat us with their military might alone, she told the assembly. They defeated us with their consistent demonstration that everything we had been told about them was a lie. Every meal that left us satisfied rather than hungry was evidence that our own government had failed us more completely than our enemies ever could. She explained how food had become the language of transformation in that small camp. Every shared recipe, every cooking lesson, every moment of casual abundance demonstrated that Americans were not the monsters of propaganda, but ordinary people who happened to have enough and were willing to share it. That generosity, she said, was what made 9 women choose to stay with their captors rather than return to freedom in their homeland. Not because America was perfect or because we had stopped being German, but because we had learned that truth, however painful, was better than comforting lies. She held up the recipe card, its edges worn soft from years of handling. This piece of paper taught me English, but it also taught me that home is not just where you come from. It is where someone feeds you, honestly treats you with dignity, even when they don't have to, and gives you the freedom to become better than the propaganda that raises you. America fed us soup. Germany fed us lies. And we chose truth even when truth meant admitting our whole lives had been a mistake. The audience sat in silence for a moment after she finished processing the weight of what they had heard. Then they began to applaud slowly at first, then with increasing intensity that felt like recognition of something important. Among the audience members was Emma Bradford, Elsa's daughter, 23 years old, and in her final year of medical school. She had decided to specialize in international humanitarian medicine, wanting to work with refugee populations and displaced persons, people like her mother had been. After the speech, Emma approached the stage where Elsie was accepting congratulations from attendees. When the crowd thinned, Emma stepped forward and embraced her mother. "That was beautiful, Mama." Elsie smiled and pulled back to look at her daughter's face. "I wanted you to understand where you come from. Not just Germany or America, but the choices that led us here. The kindness that made everything possible." "I understand," Emma said quietly. "And I want you to know I've decided something. When I open my practice, I'm going to make sure everyone gets treated the same. Rich or poor, citizen or refugee, friend or former enemy. Because you taught me that how we treat people when we don't have to tells us who we really are." Else handed her daughter the recipe card, its ink faded but still legible after 20 years. "This is yours now, your legacy. Your reminder that the smallest gestures can change everything if they come from genuine compassion rather than strategic calculation." Emma held it carefully, understanding the weight of history it carried. A simple glass bottle that had contained ordinary medicine but represented extraordinary transformation. Years later, when Emma Henderson established a free clinic serving refugee and immigrant populations in Boston, the recipe card sat framed on her office wall. Beside it had hung the photograph from that Christmas dinner in 1944, Germans and Americans cooking together as if nationality mattered less than the universal language of creating food to share. And on the clinic's wall, painted in letters large enough to read from across the room, was a quote that Emma attributed to her mother. "We measure ourselves not by how we treat our friends, but by how we feed our enemies. Thick soup changes the world one bowl at a time." The story of Camp Clinton and its 21 German prisoners became a footnote in history mentioned briefly in academic papers about POW treatment during World War II. Most of the women who returned to Germany never spoke publicly about their experiences, carrying the memories privately as they rebuilt lives in a divided nation, struggling to confront what it had been and what it might become. But the 9 who stayed in America became living bridges between former enemies. They raised American children who grew up understanding that identity was more complex than nationality, that home was where you built it, and that the most profound transformations often began with the simplest gestures. Elsa Schneider Bradford died in 1994 at the age of 73, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. The recipe card was passed to Emma, who gave it to her own daughter Sarah when she graduated from medical school in 2003. It sits now in Sarah's apartment in Baltimore, framed on the wall beside her medical degree, and a photograph of her great-grandmother standing in front of Camp Clinton in 1945. The ink has faded almost to invisibility. The paper has yellowed with age. But the card endures, a fragile testament to the moment when 21 women learned that their enemies could be kind, that their suffering had been unnecessary, and that the country they had served had betrayed them in ways both large and small. It endures as proof that sometimes the most powerful resistance to hatred and propaganda is not grand gestures or heroic acts, but simply the quiet insistence on treating people with basic human dignity. 2 white pills for a headache, thick soup for hungry prisoners. Recipe cards that taught language and built bridges. Simple things that changed everything. And the beginning of lives that proved enemies could become family if you fed them honestly and gave them the freedom to choose truth over comfortable lies. The thick soup, as it turned out, was more powerful than any weapon. The recipe cards were stronger than any propaganda. And the simple act of sharing a meal could change the world one bowl at a time.